I think, it is important to discuss the business aspect of what we need as Pan-Africanist and African people. That the aspect of building institutions and that sort of element of our struggle, that's important. But I think we also need to keep in mind there's a political struggle as well. So what really stood out to me with the summit is that one of the governments that were invited to the summit, remember I said earlier that there were some governments that weren't invited at all, but one of which that was invited that stood out to me was the government in Togo. Now, the struggle to liberate Togo from 5 decades of dictatorship is a struggle I've been involved in since 2017. And why I bring this up is that ultimately we can only advance so far if we're just discussing the economics and the business aspect of it, if we don't have the politics straight. Because ultimately the problem in many African countries is the lack of effective leadership. Far too many African countries have leadership that's really just there to benefit themselves, often at times at the expense of the people. So the situation in Togo is one where we have a dictatorship which has been in power for 5 decades. The father came into power through a military coup. The current president is the son of the father, who was there since 1967, and that's been a situation where this dictatorship has not only exploited the people of Togo, but it's created a situation where Togo is actually now one of the poorest countries in the world. And there was a poll done a few years ago where Togo actually ranked as the most miserable country in the world as well. So people there are really suffering, and it's very difficult to produce any sort of meaningful change for people in Togo as long as you have a government that's resistant to these changes. So 2017, there was a massive uprising in Togo. People were taken to the streets, protesting. In some situations, the protests actually turned violent because the government did what they usually do, which is to send military out there to go and kill and shoot at the protesters. And some of the protesters started fighting back. They started grabbing military people, beating them up, dragging them through the streets. That's actually how I got involved in that struggle, because I was watching videos of civilians dragging military men through the streets. And that's a serious revolution. I want to know what's going on there and how I can support that struggle. So that's how I got involved in that struggle. So to me, why the summit becomes important is because the reason why the government of Togo was able to sustain itself in power even after people were taken to the streets and protesting like that is because they have the military equipment to go and send the military to shoot and kill and suppress the protesting. Now, as is the case with many African countries, the government of Togo doesn't actually produce its own military equipment. It gets that from, in terms of foreign aid, from France, Israel, and the United States. So these summits, as I mentioned before, aren't simply just summits for the United States to invest in Africa. They're also summits that are used to help these governments sustain themselves in power, because they rely on this foreign aid. If it wasn't for the American foreign aid, if it wasn't for the American military aid particularly, it'd be very easy for the citizens of these countries to actually overthrow these governments. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well. Whenever we see these type of summits taking place, we have to look at, and Chris made this point, that we have to look at the politics of the African leaders that we're dealing with. And very often it's the case that African leaders will engage in the type of rhetoric that they know will appeal to Africans in the diaspora. Many of these governments will engage in a sort of Pan-Africanist type rhetoric, but you actually have to look at the policies. You have to actually look at what these political leaders are doing for their own people on the ground in the country, and how do people feel about the political leaders. So I think as Pan-Africanists, it's very important that we actually start supporting many of the revolutionary struggles we see across the continent, because it's not covered very much in the Western media, but within the last decade or so, there's been many uprisings on the African continent. Some of them have even overthrown dictatorships that have been in power for decades. Last night we were talking about I was on my brother Lumumba's program talking about Thomas Sankara, and I brought up the point that Blaise Compaoré was the man who murdered Thomas Sankara and took power. He was overthrown in a coup in 2014. So, in recent years, we're seeing that African people on the continent have been uprising. Some of these uprisings have been successful in overturning governments. And I think an aspect of Pan-Africanism, particularly if we're talking about the relationship between the diaspora and the continent, is that the diaspora needs to do a better job at supporting whatever struggles we see on the continent.